Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. It is Monday morning and I am back with Bofta. Nice to see you.
Hey, good to be here. Back again.
Yes, back again. How was your weekend?
You know, it was filled with toddler play dates. Nothing that nobody wants to really talk about, probably. But lots of fun. I always have a good time. But yeah, you know, it was a pretty good weekend here in D.C. It was, you know, pretty decent weather one day, okay weather another.
It was a good weekend for one of my favorite athletes, Rory McIlroy, who won the Masters. That was really exciting. Grand Slam. I'm not a big sports guy, but I do love golf, and I love Rory McIlroy, and I'm super happy for him, as will, I'm sure, Niall Stanage, our other host on this show. He will be very happy, I'm sure.
Now, do you golf?
I golf occasionally, not very well.
Not very well. Get your golf game up. You know, this is the season. This is the season. So it's also the season for a lot of things that are happening in D.C. We know that things are happening rapidly. You've got a lot on your radar. Let's get to it.
Well. Another day, another mainstream media narrative that President Donald Trump is losing ground in terms of his popularity. The Democratic Party desperately wants this to be the case, of course. But are they finally right? Are normal, working-class, everyday Americans starting to lose confidence in Trump? Not so fast. For a sobering dose of reality, let's turn, as we so often do, to Harry Enton, CNN's pollster, who has now made a career out of disappointing his more obviously partisan liberal colleagues. In a recent segment, Enton took a look at Trump's numbers on a key metric. Which party do you think cares more about the needs of people like you? Now, this one should be a layup for the Democrats because they've always beaten the GOP on this particular measure. The Dems are like mom. More compassionate, more inclined to take care of you, more of a there, dear sort of vibe. Republicans historically are the party of dads, strong and austere, telling you to go out and get a job and solve your own problems. Yet, take a look at the polling on this who cares more question.
Cares more about the needs for people like you. You mentioned the Cape Ball. We got a tie, even after this tariff war had already started, split between Democrats and Republicans on how people feel which party cares more for needs of people like you. And why is that so surprising? Because I want you to take a look at prior years. Democrats always lead on this question. Back in 2017, before the 2018 midterms, 13-point lead. 2005, a 23-point lead for Democrats. 1994, which was a big Republican year, a 19-point lead for Democrats. And now, all of a sudden, a tie?
Enton goes on to explain that this poll result means that Democrats retaking control of the House in the midterms is far from guaranteed.
Take a look here at the generic congressional ballot. Where we were in April of 2017, Democrats were already ahead by 7 points. In November of 2024 on this question, it was a tie, and then, of course, Republicans won control. Where are we now? It's Democrats, but just by a point. This looks very much still like what we saw in 2024, not like what we saw in 2017. If Democrats think they automatically have a ticket back to control of the House, I'd say, hold on a second, Republicans still have a real shot at this, despite all of Trump's theatrics.
Enton goes on to comment he is surprised the GOP is in such good shape given the tariff war, but he can't deny it. Trump really isn't suffering some kind of collapse in terms of his support. This is despite the fact that, the tariffs themselves were not a particularly popular policy. They are an outlier in that regard. Most of the things Trump wants to do are incredibly popular. That includes cracking down on illegal immigration, deporting violent gang members, keeping biological men from competing in women's sports, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, firing unnecessary government employees, and promoting an America First foreign policy that involves spending American taxpayer dollars at home rather than overseas. On all those policies, the Trump agenda is incredibly popular. The tariffs, on the other hand, do not poll so well, to be fair. A majority of Americans think that Trump's proposed tariff policy went too far. Now, of course, the tariff policy has already been amended, and markets have reacted hugely positively to the news that the Trump administration is working to negotiate deals with other countries to bring trade barriers as far down as possible. Voters still trust Donald Trump to deliver on his promise to create widespread economic prosperity, or at least they trust him more than they trust the Democrats, who are still reeling from lack of a unifying message. Democrats don't even know how to press their momentary advantage if they had one, due to the tariffs being unpopular. One reason for that is many progressive left-wing Dems actually supported tariffs until about 5 seconds ago, or still do. Take Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, for instance, who recently made these remarks during a speech.
I understand the motivation behind the tariffs. And I can tell you, here's where President Trump and I do agree. We do need to make more stuff in America. More cars and chips. More steel and ships. We do need fair trade.
What? Isn't she supposed to be a leading Democratic candidate for the presidency? Didn't Dem media elites and insiders want her to be the VP or even the nominee in 2024 if they could have somehow elbowed Kamala out of the way? Yet Whitmer basically agrees with Trump on trade? It's really incredible to me how lost the Democrats are on how to counter him. In fact, during a recent visit to the Oval Office, Whitmer actually appeared to try to conceal her face when the media tried to take a picture of her. She didn't want anybody to know she was there to have a meeting with Trump. She literally put something in front of her face like this. Whitmer has been mocked endlessly for this hilarious display, including from fellow liberals like Keith Olbermann, who said, "It's rare you get a shot of the exact moment a politician's career ends, but there you go." The Democrats are still in need of a leader who understands Trump's appeal, can respond to it, counter it with anything other than mixed messages. So I say the polls show that Trump's still on track. His party's on track. Not necessarily, it's a ways out to get killed in the midterms, even though that's usually what happens to the incumbent party. What do you make of all this?
Well, look, I think there's a couple of things. I think there's a lot of people who say, yes, we want things made in America, but at the same time, it's how they're going about doing it. If you want to change the way manufacturing is done and really want to make sure that it's made in America and that we have more of that control over it, that's going to take time. And so same with the layoffs. It's how he's doing it. There's a lot of people who would agree. There's a lot of government waste, no doubt about it. But how you're going about doing it. I also would argue that, Democrats, they yes, have a terrible problem with messaging right now. But at the same time, there have been some wins. So if we ignore that, I think that that's something that is a disservice to the conversation. Look at what happened at the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Look at the amount of protests that happened within, a week of that happening as well. You had Senator Cory Booker, who held the longest Senate speech. You have some wins that are happening for the party. That doesn't mean that they've got a great leader and one unified voice, and I'm certainly not saying that. But there have been some wins, and I think we have to acknowledge that they're making some headway. Look at what's happening with Senator Bernie Sanders and AOC. Anytime they're showing up, it's like a concert. I mean, Coachella, hello. But, anytime they're showing up, it just seems that there is this underbelly of support for let's do things differently. We don't like the way things are being done, and let's make sure that we're at least moving in a direction where we're gaining some momentum with whatever we can do. So I think you're seeing it with Senator Cory Booker doing what he did, AOC and Bernie Sanders. The problem is, how do you scale that? And that's where I think that they have a problem. How do you scale some of these things that are happening?
And do they have an increasingly small number of people who actually do have a message and can draw crowds, like maybe Bernie Sanders and AOC, but there's only two of them.
That's why scale is the word.
Got to be nearing retirement age one of these
Well,
years.
look, he's going strong. I mean, 83 years old? He's just got a lot of fire. I mean, they just need that whole fire to get into the party better.
It could be a fire festival, maybe.
Well, I'll let you take that one.
We'll we will be discussing the Coachella appearance in a little bit. But up next, is political violence on the rise? A suspected arsonist is in custody following attempt by him to set fire to Governor Shapiro's home in Pennsylvania. Successful attempt, really bad damage to the building, although no one was harmed. We'll discuss. Stay tuned. That's coming up next.
I'm not fearful. I'm obviously emotional. I'm worried about my family. I want my kids to be okay. I refuse to let anyone who had evil intentions like that stop me from doing the work that I love, stop me from being a leader of this Commonwealth and looking out for all Pennsylvanians.
Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro defiant after officials say an arsonist set fire to the governor's residence early Sunday morning. Now, the governor and his family were in the house at the time, but were evacuated safely. The fire was successfully extinguished, but it caused significant damage to the residence.
Pennsylvania State Police have arrested 38-year-old Cody Balmer in connection to the arson. Troopers say that Balmer turned himself in Sunday afternoon. He has been charged with attempted murder, arson, and terrorism. Governor Shapiro said this is the latest in a very concerning trend.
First, this type of violence is not okay. This kind of violence is becoming far too common in our society. And I don't give a damn if it's coming from one particular side or the other. We have to be better than this. And we have a responsibility to all be better.
Meanwhile, Utah's Republican governor, Spencer Cox, showed support for his Democratic counterpart on X, writing, quote, "Evil is far too rampant today as political violence continues to escalate. I pray that we will tone down the rhetoric, treat our political adversaries and fellow Americans with dignity and respect." And yes, this is a very
Scary.
frightening thing. No one harmed. The damage to Shapiro's residence is very extensive. If you can see those photos, I don't know if we have them to put up here. It was quite bad. So the suspect apparently brought beer bottles full of gasoline, broke in, set them on fire, said that, and then was asked by police later if he knew that people were home and could have been damaged, and he said, apparently, according to the police, he said yes, and that if he had run into Shapiro, he would have attacked him with a hammer. So this is clearly someone who was intent on doing harm, who has confessed. How tangibly related it is to political violence or rhetoric is very unclear at this point. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is probably a crazy person, certainly looks like a crazy person. I don't know that he has some really well-defined ideology or has been radicalized by a specific rhetoric or speech or what have you. We can obviously learn more about what was motivating him, but I'm very cautious always to draw clear-cut connections between, this is the rhetoric that caused. I mean, I think it's perfectly fine to say we can calm down our rhetoric, and it is a good thing, always a good practice to see someone on the other side of the political spectrum decrying violence against someone on the other side. Certainly, I'm happy to see more of that happen and for people to kind of cool it in general, but there isn't a clear-cut connection here as far as I can tell.
Right, but here's what we do know, Robby. We do know that there have been an escalation of these kinds of threats that we've seen.
Has there been?
Yes. If you look at what happened with Nancy Pelosi, there was an invasion in her home, then an assault on her husband. You look at what happened with Governor Whitmer. You look at what Congresswoman Whitmer. You look at what's also happening with members of Congress. Even in D.C., Capitol Police have documented more than 8,000 threat investigations in 2023, hundreds more than in 2022. And they are talking about the difficulty in protecting even members of Congress, because it's now extending beyond just the individual person who's in Congress to their family, to their environment. How are we going to protect them? How are we going to have enough police who are qualified and trained and who want to do this role? So I think that there has been an escalation. We're seeing it, and it's also difficult to track sometimes, like you said. Is it based on specific rhetoric or ideology? But we do know that there is an increased threat, that they're receiving more threats via email, that that we're seeing what's happening on X. We're seeing just an escalation of, is it safe? I think the question is to run for office in some cases. Is it something that people are thinking about when you look at young people and if they want to be involved in government right now, right? And do they want to put themselves out there like that and have the potential of somebody trying to come after their family? I don't think people thought about that 15 years ago.
Well, of course not. But I'd be hesitant to say, look, our elected representatives, they should not be subjected to threats of violence, certainly. It's fair to criticize them.
Sure.
And political rhetoric has always been very, very heated. There's not been I'm not going to contest whatever statistic you're referencing there. Perhaps there have been more.
Yeah.
Perhaps there have been more threats of violence investigated by the police. Most of the online kind of threats is, in fact, just talk and not some well-thought-out plan to commit violence. I don't think there's been an increase in actual attacks on members of Congress. Now, there was very famously, very infamously, an attempted political assassination that took place last year.
Right.
It was of former president at the time, Donald Trump, who was was actually shot. People behind him wounded and killed.
An assassination attempt.
That was an actual assassination attempt. Now, is that? But that's on against the right or on my side. I still wouldn't say is that because of rhetoric or there's more online discussion.
I'm just saying,
I don't really.
We've seen social media, good and bad, right? We've seen social media, what it could do for a platform, what it can do for somebody like AOC or others like Bernie Sanders. We've seen the groundswell of support that can happen. We've also seen the flip side, right, where it can get pretty nasty. What is clear though is that if you compare it to 15 years ago, what's happening to members of Congress and their families and the threats that are happening, it did not happen. It didn't happen. Well, and so I think
Well, because there was no social media.
That's my point.
Well, right,
That's
but I
my
mean,
point.
the height
That's my
of
point.
the height of threatened.
The hate and anger has been fueled so much that I think elected members of Congress, that there is more at stake if you decide to run. I think people actually think about it now more than they did before. You know, is this going to affect my family? Am I going to put my family in danger? You know, when the Obamas were in office and the amount of racist attacks that have happened and the threats that were happening. If you work inside of the White House, if you're reporting inside of the White House, every once in a while it's completely shut down because somebody is outside the White House trying to do something, what we just saw potentially with Governor Shapiro. So I think we would be remiss to even say that there hasn't been an escalation. There's clearly been an escalation if you look at all of the members of Congress. And if you talk to them, they'll tell you that too. That even if they don't, media doesn't get a hold of it, that it's happening.
Well, yes, there's been an escalation in that it is now possible to threaten people via social media, and that was not the case 15 years ago because there was no social media. We've still gone through periods of extreme violence. You know, there was a lot of political, I would say, rhetoric, and you know, there were fire bombings of mailbox bombings of government buildings, right, throughout the 60s and 70s. There were political assassination, you know, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, you know, all of that in an era before social media or this ease of communication. The height of like political assassinations in the Western world was like, you know, the late 1800s to the early 1900s.
Right, but the access now is different. The
Yeah.
access now is different. Even knowing where their whereabouts are, you can see so much more because everything's documented. It's on social media. It's in their calendar. And so if somebody wants to do harm, it's just, you have more access to do so, is my point. And I think that there's a lot of fear and anger that came with that social media. Whether this person did it because they don't like, this suspected arsonist does not like what Governor Shapiro stands for, that's a whole other matter. We don't know those details yet. That's a matter of time. Probably will come out in a police report eventually why this person decided to do what they decided to do. But we do know, again, looking back at Nancy Pelosi and looking back at just other people who have been in harm's way.
Well, look, if our elected representatives, governors, leaders need, you know, more security, better protection, I agree with that. We absolutely
100%.
need to. We can't live in a country where the people running our country are routinely threatened by not just, you know, edgy or angry rhetoric online, but actual crazy people entering their homes. Yeah, we cannot have that, and we need whatever protection to prevent that, to prevent actual assassination.
Right. So then the next question, I know we've got to wrap soon on this, but this is certainly an interesting topic. I think the next question is the challenge with recruiting high-quality candidates for policing is a whole nother topic because there's a lot of folks who don't want to be in policing like they did 50 years ago. And so the pay has to go up. Where you live matters with policing. A lot of them are trained in one area and then go to another. So how are you going to protect our elected members of Congress if you don't have quality?
Well, on that subject, I know a lot of conservatives will say that part of the reason people don't want to become police officers is it's become stigmatized in the era of Black Lives Matter and criminal justice reform and
reform
George
was
Floyd
needed.
and all of that.
Like I said, another topic, another day. But reform was needed, and I think there are some stigmas that come with it. But I think if you pay people well, you know what, a lot of people who are high-quality candidates will come through the door. But right now, I don't know if that's the case.
Well, next up, the battle over real ID continues. Is it crucial to public safety or is it government overreach? You can probably guess what I have to say, but we'll discuss it. Stay with us. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem made an announcement last week that has caused a bit of a stir.
It has something to do with real ID. Here she is.
Hi, I'm Kristi Noem, the United States Secretary of Homeland Security. If you plan on traveling, we need your help to prevent delays and to prove your identity. Get a real ID. Starting May 7th, you will need a real ID to travel by air or to visit federal buildings in the United States.
Now, actually, some of the backlash here is coming from people on the right. Congressman Thomas Massie, Republican, for instance, wrote on X, "Real ID isn't needed and won't stop terrorists from hijacking planes. Most of the 9/11 hijackers held Saudi, UAE, Egyptian, or Lebanese passports. Real ID is a national standard and a database of IDs that's primarily a tool for control of Americans. Trump shouldn't enforce it."
Now, per the TSA, 81% of travelers who go through airport checkpoints are already compliant. Congress had passed the Real ID Act back in 2005, which then allowed for there to be a federal standard on state IDs. IDs, but this measure was supposed to go into effect in 2008. It never did. TSA spokesman Carter Langston defended the initiative, writing, "Identity verification is a linchpin in security, and we will make sure that passengers are verified as being who they say they are before they can go beyond the checkpoint."
Well, I am very frustrated to hear this is going into effect. Now, of course, most people already have a real ID if you had to update your driver's license anytime recently, depending on what state you live in. They've already made your driver's license real ID compliant, so probably this isn't going to affect you in that way. It will affect you in having your license now be in this database, and which I know a lot of libertarian people who have serious privacy concerns, Bofta, about whether hackers will actually be able to penetrate that database and get your information. And then Thomas Massey's point is very well taken, that what this is not, again, we're doing security theater, we're still, however, 20 years later, 25 years later, we're still doing 9/11 based security theater, doing things that are more restrictive, more difficult, more burdensome, more inconvenient for Americans, because national security and safety, with no shred of evidence, this is going to help protect against terrorism or anything of that nature. The TSA itself is the textbook example of this. The entire agency should be abolished. Paging Dr. Elon Musk to the Doge operating room. I want TSA gone. It is a abhorrent waste of money and inefficient and doesn't contribute to our safety whatsoever.
Well, I'm not going to go that far with TSA, but I do agree with you that the real ID, I think that it wasn't needed. First off, if you look at just the possibility that in time this could be used at the voting booth. This could be also used to get your Social Security check, right? So I think that in time, there's challenges with Real ID that are going to keep pressing on. I think that also, if you look at the cost that this required, that's part of the reason, Robby, why so many folks were against this, why it took so long to become law. It was estimated back by the federal government in 2007, 2008, that this was going to cost $11 billion to implement. So Doge, take a look at that. They would have had a field day. $11 billion to implement. So if we think about sometimes some of the things that are going into law, I think we need to think about how much is this actually going to cost for states to, make sure that everyone has this and it's implemented properly, and you have the processes and the systems and all of that kind of thing. So I think that that's two major points that I have with it. As far as TSA, we need TSA, Robby. We need TSA.
No, we don't.
We need TSA.
We don't need it at all.
Folks,
we should get rid of it.
Next time you go to the airport and you don't see TSA, you're going to be like, how are we going to make sure that everything is safe?
By locking the cockpit doors.
Oh, come on.
Prevents.
Oh, come
no,
on. Come on.
But,
let's be serious.
No, I'm being completely serious. They don't. What you think the plane isn't safe to fly on because you have a hairspray bottle that's over 4 ounces? It's nonsense. It's utter because we have to take off our shoes. Oh, we took off our shoes and belts. Now we're safe.
Well, they're getting better at
an idiotic ritual.
They're getting better at actually the process. So if you go to different airports,
they don't catch
different airports.
Knives, and also you can assemble. I mean, I don't want to get this video banned.
Let's not give people ideas.
They sell everything you need to make an incendiary device once you've already gotten past the security.
So look, so TSA is a whole other issue, right? We could create a total topic on
alcohol
rising
and lighters.
on rising about the TSA. But Real ID, I think there's a lot of challenges. I also think when you think of the House bill that's also happening simultaneously that is related to voters and having to require another proof of citizenship. I think that's a whole nother way of voter suppression. So I think when you have these things happening, it reminds us of the poll tax. It reminds us of what people had to do in order to vote. And so I think when you get into the Real ID mix and you get into the House bill that's currently, going back and forth, I think that we get into some serious waters when it comes to, are we working to get people who are not only minorities and disenfranchising folks, but also those who are unhoused, those who have gone through national disasters, can't find their birth certificate. I think you run into some serious territory when you start to go backwards in how we treat voting and identification in this country.
Yeah, I just don't want to have to move throughout the country like it's some militarized zone, like under some communist state, where you have to there's checkpoints everywhere and barbed wire, and you have to show some kind of ID. I mean, that's a little bit of hyperbole and dramatizing it, but that's the way we're moving if we do this. And that's not. And again, they'll say it's for safety, it's for national security, but they'll never demonstrate or prove why that is the case. Yeah. How does this actually make us safer?
I'm agreeing with you on that one. Yeah, I think on a rare moment we're in agreement.
Okay, but the TSA too.
No, that's another day.
Hear me out on this.
That's another day.
The planes are safe because they used to allow them to be taken captive. Like, you know that, right? Like, until 9/11, it was standard procedure. If somebody tries to hijack the airplane, you just let them do it because they were going to fly it to Cuba. There was tons of plane hijackings throughout the 60s and 70s, and I think even into the 80s, because they were hijacked by crazy activist people. Then the 9/11 hijacking happens. They fly the plane into a building. We'll never let that happen again because we lock the cockpit doors and you can't take the actual pilot hostage. And you can't blow up.
I think there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes.
That's what I have to say.
Well, I think there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that you and I are not always privy to, where TSA is helping out. I do think we need TSA, and I think it's a big overreach to say eliminate TSA. So again, we agreed at least on one part of this topic, but not the other. So we'll get back to it another day.
You don't miss the era when you could just show up to the airport.
I don't think I've ever shown up. I mean, and you're young.
Well, now you have to
I don't think I've ever just
you have to get there
shown
2.5 hours in advance to do this song and dance where they
you gotta
abuse
pack
you
better.
and
Pack
sexually
better.
assault you as you move through.
Overreach. They're
the
not
ones overreaching,
sexual.
quite literally.
They do not. I am not. I know that there are things that happen, but I think to say that they're always doing sexual assault is again another. That's an overreach. That's stretching across. That's stretching across a little bit too much. I won't go that far. You need to pack better, Robby. That's what it is. You need to pack better. All right, let's move on to our next topic coming up. President Trump hosts one of his biggest critics for dinner. Did he win comedian Bill Maher over? We'll see. That's up next.
President Trump hosted his longtime critic, comedian Bill Maher, at the White House, a dinner organized by Maher's friend and Trump ally, Kid Rock. But Maher's recounting of the dinner is not what you might expect from such an outspoken critic of Trump. Let's take a look.
He laughs. I'd never seen him laugh in public, but he does, including at himself. And it's not fake. Believe me, as a comedian of 40 years, I know a fake laugh when I hear it. It doesn't matter who he is at a private dinner with a comedian. It matters who he is on the world stage. I'm just taking as a positive that this person exists, because everything I've ever not liked about him was, I swear to God, absent, at least on this night with this guy.
Maher also made some other shocking admissions from the dinner. The room where former President Bill Clinton had relations with Monica Lewinsky is now a storage room for Trump's merch. Maher also had Trump sign a list of almost 60 insults the president has hurled at him over the years, including digs like dummy, sick, and really dumb guy.
The outcome, Maher says that Trump was gracious and measured.
But not everyone is receiving the dinner as well as Maher. Users on X took to the platform to bash the comedian. Commentator Keith Olbermann writing, BTW, don't overanalyze Maher prostituting himself to Trump. I've known Bill since 1978. He was a shameless opportunist with no real principles then, and he remains so. This is so he can keep his HBO show. Actor and director Andy Ostroy posted, so he acts mean, nasty, callous, cruel, dangerous, and destructive on social media, at pressers, in speeches, and in his policies. But in person, he's just a swell guy. That makes him a sociopath.
Keith Olbermann, what a ridiculous...
Look, this is a PR stunt by Trump, played masterfully. That's what that is.
Well, Trump is a master of PR. But look, I like when people who don't otherwise agree sit down together. I think that's a good thing. I like Bill Maher. I don't agree with everything he has to say, but he's kind of someone of my general vibes and worldview. I think it's a sign of the times that he's softened toward Trump a little bit. I think that goes to show that Trump is making gains just with Bill Maher comes from the world of un-PC comedy, of anti-wokeness, and the leader of the political faction that identifies with being anti-political correctness and anti-woke is in fact Donald Trump. So I think you can still criticize him, you can still have a kind of combative relationship with him, but this kind of friendliness is again, not to be unexpected by someone who more and more probably falls into the Trump camp, because the other side, progressive liberals, are a bunch of humorless scolds who all hate Bill Maher because he's too moderate.
Oh, come on. That's a
issues.
stretch. That's a stretch.
Is
I
it?
mean, really?
know.
Come on.
I mean, I know Bill Maher is not well liked on the left. Because
Well, I think sometimes, and I think other times it depends. But I think either way, you know, it's interesting that Bill Maher came out with this because he criticized Geraldo back in 2018, who also was saying that in private Trump is this type of character who he described, and he criticized Geraldo for that. He openly criticized him.
Well, 2018 was like 1,000 years ago.
Was it 1,000 years ago?
Yeah.
But still, I think that when it suited him to then have this conversation, you know, he decided not to be critical as much. I just think, you know, again, it was well played by Trump. As you said, he is a PR guy, and I think that he knows who and the stage that Bill Maher has, and that this was going to come back to a national audience and sway people to his direction. So I think that it was just well played, and it's a beautiful PR stunt. And I think that Bill Maher was naive. Why would you think that he would attack you at dinner?
Yeah.
I mean, you're in his house.
Well, and Bill Maher also provides a platform that I appreciate, because it is one of the only major media spaces where you do actually have people of contrasting viewpoints brought on at the same time. You know, Bill Maher does interviews and panels with a range of, with some Republican, Democratic political officials, media figures from all over. Steve Bannon was on. They had a really fascinating conversation about whether Trump can run for a third term, with Bill Maher very reasonably being like, but doesn't it say no? And Steve Bannon saying, yeah, I don't care, he's going to anyway. And some other really interesting guests. And, you know, they argue and they discuss, and I think it's useful. And so it's a good, you know, there's not our show does that, where you have actually, you know,
dialogue.
We're arguing, and that's the way it's supposed to be, and I think viewers appreciate that.
Yeah, I do think that I don't know if you, when you watched it, if you felt the same way, Robby, but when I watched it and I heard the way he presented this monologue, recapping the dinner, it kind of felt a little Dave Chappelle to me, and the way he positioned it, and the way he was telling a story, but inserted a joke. Yes, another funny guy. And so it just reminded me of that. I'm not saying, you know, there's any relation to it, but it did remind me, and I thought, is he trying to evoke some of that storytelling piece really well, the way Dave Chappelle does? Just saying. So anyways, it was interesting. Look, he went to the dinner, he brought back his feedback, and as he said, make what you will of it. He was giving his side. I just think that a lot of folks, a lot of Americans are looking at him and saying, yeah, you got. You got.
I don't know about that.
All right.
Next up, things got very heated on the Joe Rogan podcast with Dave Smith and Douglas Murray. Stay tuned. An episode of the Joe Rogan Experience has gone mega viral on X.
The episode featured political commentator Douglas Murray and comedian Dave Smith.
Now, for context, Murray is very pro-Israel, while Smith is incredibly critical of what Israel has been doing.
Within the first couple of minutes, Murray confronted Rogan for not having a more balanced list of guests in relation to the Israel and Ukraine conflicts. Take a listen.
There's been a tilt in the conversation, in both conversations, in the last couple of years, and it's largely to do with people who have appointed themselves experts who are not experts. I think Dave is doing that, very obviously. Dave's a comedian, but he's now mainly talking about Israel.
The conversation then got a little more heated. Murray and Smith were debating the Israel-Gaza war. Smith was talking about the poor living conditions in Gaza and how there was a shortage of goods there due to an Israeli blockade.
Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been?
Well, am I not allowed to talk about it now? I've never been to. Have you ever been to Nazi Germany? Are you allowed to have feelings about them?
You can't time travel, but you can. But you can travel.
Okay, but so what? So what's the point? Like,
no,
okay.
I find that
lots of people have been there and agree with me, and lots of people have been there and agree with you.
Yeah, but
so
if
I don't
you're
know
going to
what
spend a year and a half talking about a place, you should at least do the courtesy of visiting it.
There were mixed reactions on X to the entire thing. Article 3 Project Senior Counsel Will Chamberlain wrote, to the extent there was an actual debate between Dave Smith and Doug Murray on Rogan, Murray won it, mostly by default. The first hour and a half was mostly Smith and Rogan retreating to their mott over and over again. Murray described it as punching jelly. He was right.
On the other hand, journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote, Murray's constant invocation of credentialism, only experts should be heard, is also bizarre. Murray has an undergrad degree in English. I don't care at all, but his metric of expertise should disqualify him from talking about everything except the Canterbury Tales. I also have nothing more than an English literature degree, so I hope we're not making the argument that that's the only thing we're able to talk about. So this is a very, I think, illustrative debate that happened between these individuals. I don't know if you know them as well as I do, Bofta. I'm actually kind of friendly with all the people involved.
All right.
Douglas Murray, who I've met a couple times, is a conservative writer, thinker, editor from England. Dave Smith is a libertarian podcaster and comedian. He's been on Rising before. Maybe they've both been on Rising before, I'm not sure. Dave Smith at least has, who I generally agree with. So it will not be surprising that on this particular issue, I do in fact agree with Dave Smith more in terms of the policy. And I also agree with him that you shouldn't, it's weird to say, and Douglas Murray does understand this, he would agree with this in other contexts. Like he is also, I agree with him on, for instance, COVID overreach, that a lot of the COVID policies like that we discussed with our guest today were bad, and that the things the experts said were wrong. And he knows that. So then I would not also make the argument simultaneously that, but then on this complicated foreign policy issue, right, you have to be an expert to weigh in on it, right? Well, experts disagree on how to handle Israel-Gaza. People who've been, and then you have to have been there to have an opinion on it. That's obviously preposterous. As Dave notes, people who've been there have, some agree with him, some agree with him. That's all over the place. The part of the argument, which we didn't play, where I'm a little bit more sympathetic to Douglas Murray, he talks about some of the guests that Joe Rogan has had on that have
Peddled baseless
bizarre
claims,
views.
Bizarre views.
Well, baseless, yeah. I don't like to use the word baseless claims, but have tried to do revisionism to a greater degree than I am comfortable with on, like, was Winston Churchill responsible for World War II? That started to be a little bit silly.
Definitely.
But I think it's fine to have those people on. You just got to, really interrogate their beliefs. So I agree with Murray that, sometimes just platforming every controversial, contrarian, provocative person doesn't mean every single thing that people who disagree with experts think is correct about everything, but that it is also okay to disagree with experts because they're frequently wrong and have been proven to be wrong over and over again, and they actually have lots of internal disagreements. That's my long-winded, my laying out my philosophy here.
Some pieces I agree with you in here, right? Some pieces I agree with you here. I think the bigger picture of this is Joe Rogan has an incredible amount of influence, particularly over young men. A lot of voters tuned in to Joe Rogan who are on the fence, right? There's so much power that he has with this platform. And I think what was being called out, which I respect the call out, is just saying, look, if you're going to bring on folks who are extremely controversial, often have baseless and disproven claims, I'll say it if you won't, but in my opinion, then you either got to have the research that you're doing, or you need to bring on another expert to counter it. I think you need to be mindful of the influence you have, and do your due diligence to make sure that you have other people on who can also counter it, or you're going to do the research yourself, Joe. I think it's fine if you want. It's your show. If you want to bring on controversial people, okay, but there's some due diligence involved if you're going to, so that you're not spreading misinformation, particularly during key points in our, life, like the pandemic, right? So I just think that being mindful of it. So I do respect the call out. I think every once in a while, somebody with that much influence does need to be called out. How are you handling the amount of influence that you have? And Joe Rogan can say, I'm not trying to hurt people. I think he said that, this is not what I'm trying to do. But you've got to be careful with that. And I think that there is, whether you like it or not, you've got influence. And you've got to be mindful of that. So.
But what counts as spreading misinformation? Is it misinformation to say masks don't work or we have no evidence that masks made any difference? I mean, they would have said that's misinformation, then that turned out to be true. I mean, Fauci, was he spreading misinformation at the beginning when he said don't bother with masks, and then he changed his mind to say actually please mask as aggressively as possible at all times, and then further revise it to actually unless you're wearing the very most protective mask, it's not really doing anything. I mean, that's that was called misinformation at every step. Is it a lab? We think it might have come from a lab. That was branded a racist conspiracy theory by every elite expert gatekeeper person. Now it turns out that's the more likely cause of the pandemic, according to the Energy Department and the CIA and the FBI. So what gets called misinformation, yeah, sometimes maybe turns out to be misinformation. I don't think what they said about
Young and
what some
healthy
people
people
said about
don't need to get vaccinated. Young and
They
healthy
don't.
people don't need to get vaccinated.
they don't.
Okay, so we're going to disagree there.
Well, but they don't. I mean, that's a great example. If you think that's misinformation, that's true. You can now. To be clear, I don't think there are.
That's been proven, though, that
what? What's been proven?
Young and healthy people still needed to get vaccinated. It didn't mean that you were immune. It didn't mean that you were immune because you were young and healthy.
But the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting COVID.
But it reduces the chances of you landing in a serious, potential, complicated hospital
If you're
situation.
young and healthy, the chances of landing in a serious complication from COVID are next to nothing anyway. So there is no need.
Well, there were people who were in the hospital who were young.
Do you see? Have you seen that? See, this is misinformation. If you see the COVID curve, we're talking. You have to be beyond a certain age or in bad health to have any serious risk. Now, I don't think there's any danger to getting.
But to say blanket statements, blanket statements that young and healthy people don't need vaccinations.
They don't need it. They can get it. I got vaccinated. I got boosted. But the science.
I'm not saying that you wouldn't get it, and we're going down the rabbit hole. But I'm not saying that you wouldn't.
I've gotten COVID three times.
Right, but how serious was the COVID when you got it? Did you end up in the hospital, unable to breathe, on life support? Right, that's what the vaccine was talking about.
Statistics suggest there'd be almost no chance of that for me anyway. That's
you
what
could
I'm
be
saying.
spreading it to other people at the same
But
time.
it doesn't stop you from spreading it to other people. 90-something% of the country has gotten vaccinated, and everyone has gotten COVID.
Not everyone.
Not
everyone has.
90% something of the country has gotten COVID.
Sure.
2/3 or more have gotten vaccinated. It didn't stop. Look, this is a great example. The experts said, everybody's got to get this because this is how we stop the pandemic. This is going to get us down to 0 cases. That didn't work. That was flawed.
No,
I still
agree
think
with
it
you
is
that
important to get it.
There were pieces that were flawed. If we go back to Joe Rogan, I just think that this should be the type of dialogue that you're having on the show. Okay, case in point. So I just think that what he does is let the person just run.
Yeah.
There is no back and forth sometimes. He's literally letting them run with what they believe is true, versus countering it more. And he just lets them have the mic, and he's got 11 million listeners.
Well, I'm fine with him pushing. He should push back on, if that's your claim, push back on guests when they say things. I agree with that. I don't have any problem with that. And I was glad to see him have this debate between two people who strongly disagree on this issue.
Yeah.
And he did a little bit of moderating the conversation. And, people can make up their own conclusions for who won. There are some people, probably people who just, are still partisan on the Israel issue. Think if you're a real supporter of Israel, you think Douglas Murray was more persuasive. If you're very skeptical of what Israel is doing, you agree more with Dave Smith. But I like, these kinds of conversations are happening in alternative media, not in mainstream media, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Up next on Rising, is the Trump administration preparing for a war with Iran? Stay tuned. President Trump does not mince words when it comes to making threats, and he has the bombs to prove it. Satellite images captured 6 stealth B-2 bombers on the runway at Joint Base Diego Garcia on the Indian Ocean, ready to deliver on POTUS's dire warning to Iran: shutter your nuclear plans or else.
As questions mount over the possibility of a U.S.-Iran war, the Pentagon has yet to publicly acknowledge its arsenal of B-2s. And while very visible to Tehran, the American people have been kept in the dark. Joining us now to discuss this is journalist Ken Klippenstein. Welcome.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Talk a little bit about the magnitude of this threatening message, because I don't think that the American public is really paying attention.
Yeah, so 6 B-2 bombers in itself might not sound like very much, but this is an extraordinarily expensive stealth aircraft that historically there's never been as large of a deployment as there is now. This is the largest ever forward deployed B-2 bomber situation that we've seen ever, and that's something that expert after expert has corroborated. And so I think the American people are owed an explanation about what the objectives here are, because as you pointed out at the top of the segment, the Iranians know, the U.S. government clearly knows, and when you park 6 of those out on a base not under hangars, where they're visible to commercial satellites, to drones that are going around, that I'm sure the Iranians have, that's very clearly signaling to them and saying, hey guys, check this out. And for the Pentagon press secretary not to just say the same thing to the American people seems to me insulting, because you can't make the case that this is operational security, necessary secrecy, if you're just having them parked there out in the open. So, I'd like an explanation.
You write on Substack that, I'm quoting you, if the Pentagon doesn't really want to do X because it thinks the risks are too high or because it thinks the order is ill-considered, it has an arsenal of passive-aggressive ways of gumming up the works to make sure it doesn't happen except as it wants. Like, what do you actually mean, Mr. President? Nukes, covert action, World War III, this looks like Ukraine, or worse, sir, are you sure? They could be pushing back, and in fact, the mainstream media's expectation is that they've celebrated acts of passive resistance inside Trump. Certainly during the first term, there were people who later came forward to say they did all of that, which is a long way of saying if our top national security, military experts and advisors don't like this course of action, they could do all sorts of things to obstruct Trump. Are they?
Yes, and they've done so with virtually every president. And it's something that's concerning in any case, however you feel about the president. You want civilian elected control in charge of the armed forces. That is something that is central to the American Constitution, and I think should be to any free society. And so when they move these B-2 bombers, it's possible that Trump isn't even brought in on the decision because CENTCOM operates on its own autopilot. And so, when Trump goes around and makes these statements, some of the language has been really alarming. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a president as explicitly as Trump has threatened to bomb this country. Whatever you think of that. I mean, he is saying it publicly. We can all see what he's saying. CENTCOM then has to make the decision. U.S. Central Command, that's the combatant command in the Middle East, has to then make the decision, okay, how do we prepare ourselves so that we can effectuate U.S. policy if the president decides that he is going to carry through on that? And the question is, to what extent is that being communicated to the White House? To what extent does Trump realize what he's saying, which could be the context of a, hardball negotiation, could be something that he's completely serious about. In any case, the hand should be talking to the brain here and coordinating these things. And when they don't say this stuff publicly, that suggests that coordination is not happening, or when the White House doesn't say that publicly. And that's something that, regardless of, what your position is on this issue, it would be great if that coordination could happen. And that's one of the important parts of transparency. Not only does it inform the public, it allows the government to understand and all be on the same page about what's happening.
Talk a little bit, Ken, about why Diego is a strategic base.
Yeah, so that allows them to be based, but not actually based in the Middle East proper. So we have bases all over, Qatar, another base, and it's called Muwafiq Salti in Jordan, that we stage a lot of things out of. But as I understand it, a lot of those Gulf Arab nations are uneasy with this for the very obvious reason that they are uncomfortable with escalating things to a certain point with Iran. And that in itself is a good reason that we should have a public debate about what we think our position on this should be. Maybe people are fine with it. Maybe they like it. In which case, at least we had that debate and people are on the same page, instead of this kind of, very quiet signaling. As one retired general, I quote in the story, mentions, this is a very clear signal to Iran. It's saying, look at our sword. This is what you'll be dealing with if you don't, come to the negotiating table, which again is the president's prerogative to do. I just wish that he'd convey that to the public so that they could have some role in saying, okay, we like this or we don't like this. Because again, all sorts of parties involved, from not just Iran, our government, but these governments in the Middle East, they clearly know what's going on. That's why we had to send them to Diego Garcia, a British base that I think we lease from, because it's not going to ruffle feathers in the same way that these very expensive and huge bases we have in, like I was mentioning, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, that wouldn't tolerate it. And the question is, well, why wouldn't they tolerate it? Okay, because it's actually a pretty, divisive and controversial point of action. All the more reason to have some kind of a discussion about it.
I think if I were to try to steelman the Trump position, I would say, well, he unlike some other members of the Republican Party, is not inherently for basically regime change in the Middle East or war with Iran. There are certainly other Republicans like Lindsey Graham who have long, or even John McCain before him, who very much on an ideological basis wanted a kind of larger, John Bolton from the last administration wanted a much more direct and larger confrontation with the government of Iran. I don't think that actually is Trump. I think he wants to negotiate some kind of deal and some kind of arrangement with Iran for peace, and probably the bluster he's engaged in now, as has been the case with the tariffs, is aimed at getting them to negotiate, not actually aimed at having out-and-out confrontation. But he doesn't want to say that to the American people because he doesn't want to show his negotiating hand, right? That would be the defense of what he's doing. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assessment. But the problem is, and something I tried to explore in the article, is that when you do that, the military is taking its own set of actions, and that signals to Iran things that might not be what you intended to signal to them. And that's one of the problems with how the military conducts itself historically. They kind of go, they exercise a lot of discretion in saying, okay, that's what the president says. How do we operationalize that? Or maybe what do we think is smart? I mean, that's the best case. Maybe they even say, okay, well, here's what we want to do instead. All of that leads to the risk of miscommunication, which is a huge problem in military conflict generally. History is rife with examples of wars that neither party intended to happen, but through, these gradual steps on the escalatory ladder led to something which nobody intended to happen. And again, that is where transparency is really important, because that allows, again, not just the public to be brought into things, but everything to be, better understood, like what it means. But I think that you have a reasonable interpretation, and the article in the article I wrote, I'm kind of making the case for that. Communication is more complicated than just what the president is saying, because all these agencies decide how to implement it, or at worst, how to undercut it. And sunlight is how you drive that out.
Ken, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Up next, did our politics fail us during the heart of COVID? We'll talk more about that. The COVID-19 pandemic led to the greatest emergency mobilization ever, but was it the most effective? In a new book, In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us, authors Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee look back at the policies that upended our lives then, now, and for years to come.
Policies implemented to control the spread of COVID actually ended up confining people to their homes, prohibiting kids from going to school, virtually shutting down every social experience. And where did it leave us? Joining us now is the co-author of the book, Stephen Macedo, professor of politics and the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. Thanks for coming on Rising. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I attended a fascinating dinner with you a few weeks ago where you and your co-author described the book in detail. It's a terrific book. I read a lot of it. I really recommend that people check it out. I was particularly impressed by how you detailed the response to COVID on university campuses, how at the most elite, credentialed, professional, expert level, the kinds of people that, we're supposed to say, yeah, these people are really smart people, they'll know how to handle something like this, is where you see the policies that have now, in retrospect, in hindsight, maybe even at the time, if you're going to look into how pandemics are actually supposed to be handled, did not work and made people utterly miserable, and were actually so far apart from the way it should have been handled. Can you go into more detail?
Well, yes, and the most surprising thing in a way is there were many pre-COVID pandemic planning documents that examined the various measures that were imposed under COVID, from school closures, social distancing measures, business closures, the whole suite of social distancing requirements, border closures, contact tracing, and so on. And these pre-COVID pandemic plans looked into the empirical evidence for all of these measures and found the evidence weak and cast doubt on their effectiveness. And the other thing that those pre-COVID pandemic plans said was that the cost of these measures will be considerable and certain, and that those costs would fall disproportionately on children and the less well-off, including the 1/3 of the workers in the American economy who are essential workers, who had to keep working throughout the pandemic to keep our electricity on, to keep the internet running, food coming to our houses, food being processed, trucks being driven with all that material, and so on. And no special provisions were made for the vulnerable members of that essential working class. Some general provisions were made for ensuring against evictions and some income support, but no special provisions for the vulnerable members of the essential workers. So we should have paid more attention to the pre-COVID pandemic plans, and we should have had more robust debate about these measures, in the summer and fall of 2020, as Europeans reopened their schools, and schools across America in much of the country stayed closed for much of the 2020-21 school year, especially in Democratic states. We see a large division emerging over the summer of 2020 between Republican and Democratic states, with Democratic states maintaining stay-at-home orders and school closures and other measures much longer than Republican states. And unfortunately, what we don't find, what we lack evidence for, are indices or measures that suggest that those lockdowns and school closures and so on reduced COVID mortality. We just lack evidence for that at this point. We can't reject the hypothesis that these measures had no significant effect on COVID mortality. But we have more and more evidence developing about their costs for school achievement, for school attendance, with one-third higher rates of chronic absenteeism, high rates of depression, and so on.
Stephen, I think one thing that's very apparent in America is that we love our personal freedoms. I'm curious, how much did that hurt us during the pandemic? And do you go into, dynamic detail about what that may have cost us? Because we didn't really listen always when lawmakers, when the CDC reported certain things. And did that hurt us? And how much?
It's quite possible that it did. I'll add to what I just said that my co-author Francis Lee compiled this data from the CDC on the 50 states, and it shows that you can't really show, we lack the evidence to show significant differences across the states with long versus shorter lockdown measures. But the same results appear cross-nationally in other studies of countries across the world, or countries across Europe. I think it's a 27-nation study by Pizzato et al., Italian scholars, and they failed to find significant benefits from longer lockdowns across the 27 states of Europe. So, it may be that our love of freedom, which is not unreasonable, played a role, but cross-nationally, it's hard to find evidence that these measures had great effects, because we don't really understand what happened in China. The data from there is not entirely reliable. So there's still so much to learn that we need to learn before the next pandemic. That's one of our bottom lines, is that we had very weak evidence for the effectiveness of all of these very costly measures going into COVID. And we still have very weak evidence concerning their effectiveness coming out now 5 years later. And that's egregious, really, that we haven't gathered better evidence on these very costly measures.
Egregious, and really a damning indictment, because my understanding is you can see some evidence when you move into the phase of the pandemic where there are vaccines available, in terms of different performance of states based on underlying health profile and how fast the vaccine deployment was, and how much it was adapted by the people there, people who fell into vulnerable categories with vaccines, really helping for elderly Americans and people who suffer severe underlying health risks, all that kind of thing. So then you do see some difference in the performance, but up until then, despite really stark differences between, for instance, red and blue states, or elite liberal, for lack of a better word, enclaves like university campuses, where you have people, have to mask up while they're on the basketball court. Some of these universities, don't gather in your dorm room, stay in your dorm room, don't do any social events. There was a police state set up at these universities to police masking and levels of gathering. Of course, the schools being shut down, if they're public schools in liberal areas versus private schools or public schools in many red states. Really stark differences. and that were harmful, that were clearly deleterious for people's mental health, their academic achievements, their crime rising as a result of this, people being on the margins of society. And we don't see any difference whatsoever in the how deadly it was. If you went through all of that, how protected your community was really no better off. That should prompt a reckoning.
Yes, that's exactly what we're hoping for, and you're exactly right describing the difference between vaccination and all these other measures. You do see an uptick in death rates in Republican states post-vaccination because of the greater vaccine hesitancy that existed there. So that's a clear result that can be seen in these aggregate data. But in the aggregate data on a state-by-state basis, we can't find good evidence for a reduction in mortality from all of these other measures, which were extremely costly, as you say. So we clearly do need a reckoning, a comprehensive reassessment, which is what we try to begin in the book, beginning from these pre-COVID pandemic plans, the debates around the origin of the virus, whether from a lab or from nature, and the unwillingness of many people to entertain the possibility of a leak from a lab. And I feel that debate is still not being treated fairly in much of the press. So there are many, many questions that need to be considered and need much more careful consideration than they've been given so far.
Stephen Macedo, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Next up, a surprise guest at Coachella whose anti-billionaire message had the crowd going wild. We'll discuss.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders made a surprise debut at Coachella this weekend, and he had a stark message for the crowd. Take a listen here.
This country faces some very difficult challenges. The future of what happens to America is dependent upon your generation. We need you to stand up to fight for justice.
This appearance just hours after a rally that Sanders held in Los Angeles with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was part of their Fighting Oligarchy tour. Over 36,000 were in attendance, making it their biggest rally so far.
The people of this country do not want oligarchy. They do not want authoritarianism.
This movement is not about partisan labels or purity tests, but it's about class solidarity.
Now, users on X applauded Sanders' Coachella speech. Brian Krassenstein writing, he went from the LA rally to Coachella. He's 83 and fighting like this. This should be an inspiration to all of us. If he can do this, we can all do a little more.
Other users were quick to point out maybe that there's a hypocrisy here. Conservative Greg Price said something incredibly ironic about a multi-millionaire who owns 3 houses and has been a politician for the last 50 years, speaking about the evils of oligarchy and wealth to a crowd at a music festival that costs at least $1,500 to attend. Yeah, the Coachella price tag is very significant. Not a lot of...
not where you were this weekend.
Ordinary. I was not there, no. Not a lot of ordinary working class people there. That's for the elites, and, that's fine. He can...
Well, look, and I think a lot of folks, coming to him and saying, well, look at you. He's a best-selling author. He's made his money that way. Also, he's been a congressman forever. He's 83 years old.
Well, unlike him, I think it's okay for wealthy people to have their money and keep it. So we have a difference of opinion.
Well, and 3
I have
homes.
No problem with it.
Let's be honest. Most senators usually do have a home in D.C. So that's one right there. Then you have the home where he lives in Vermont. And then you have his, whatever, lake house or whatever it might be. So 3 homes. You're 83 years old. You have, 2 best-selling books. Right. I'm just
anything
saying,
out of me, I don't care.
Right. I'm just saying.
You can get a 4th home, 5th home, I don't care.
Right. I'm just saying. So he did his thing. He didn't grow up with a silver spoon.
No.
He grew up in a rent-controlled Brooklyn apartment, So, look, he's 83 years old.
Like our current vice president, he comes from humble origins.
So there you go. So, I don't know, what's your take on him, also the crowds that are really showing up for Bernie and AOC?
Look, Bernie has an ability to generate crowds. That's been a clear factor. I've always thought he has been maligned unfairly by the Democratic establishment, that they would have made themselves a more formidable party, Democrats would, by giving him more attention by getting on board with what he was
Earlier
representing.
on.
It's clear that he would have stood a much better chance, I think, of defeating Donald Trump in 2016 if he had been the candidate instead of the perpetually unpopular Hillary Clinton, who was forced on the party by the elites she had worked to cater to for years, and that was very bad. Now, having said that, I don't agree with Bernie's policies substantively, so I have no real desire to see him be able to implement them, but I admire, I guess, that he believes in something and is working toward it. And obviously, some things I agree with him on. He's somewhat to my orientation, I guess, on foreign policy and in not leaning into identity politics. He wants to focus things in a class-based way that I think at least makes more internal sense from a leftist perspective. So I appreciate that about him, and he's
well. Look, one thing you can say about him is he's been on brand and on message for years. I mean, he hasn't really swayed a ton. He's really
he believes exactly what he believes.
Yeah, he stayed steady, and I think people
want that. As a hippie in 1968.
But I think that the Democratic Party could use that, right? People are drawn to people who stand for something, and what Bernie Sanders and AOC are really showing, I think, is that they believe in something, they're standing for it, and it's attracting a lot of people who feel the same way. And I think that the Democratic Party could learn a lot by watching these two. The question then becomes for the party is, well, how do you scale this message, and is everyone else buying in? And that's something that remains to be seen. I don't know.
They can't and they won't because they have yet to take Bernie seriously or listen to him in any way. And the corruption of AOC shows that. She has become, now she is joining him on these rallies, but she has become, quiescent. She's fallen in place with leadership. They didn't give her that job, the oversight job that I've mentioned this 1,000 times on the show, but it's such a good example of Democrat elites' failed priorities is to make Jerry Connolly an aging and ailing figure of the old guard head of oversight instead of AOC, someone who can actually, like Bernie, draw a crowd.
And who actually reads the bills and reads and talks about them extensively.
Yeah, reading the bills should be the bare minimum of acceptable behavior for everyone in Congress.
Right, but it's not, and she's called them out on that when she first even became part of Congress. So I think that'll be interesting to wait and see thing. Like, let's see how much I think respect they give what the two of these individuals have been able to do pretty much in any state they're going to. They're like the rock stars. So, but yeah, that Coachella price tag is something.
But they've been on the scene. Bernie's been on the scene literally for forever. Yeah. AOC's been on the scene for a while now. Are there new people coming in to the Democratic Party as elected members of Congress or governors or whatever who tap into what they tap into, who generate excitement among both young people and working class people and are, because Bernie clearly achieved something. Yeah. And AOC is maybe the obvious successor of what he's achieved, but who else is there? We used to talk about the squad growing and whatever it was, leftism, democratic socialism.
Well, they've got to figure that out.
They're not. I don't think they've brought more people in. I think the heyday of that moment has come down a little bit.
Yeah, I think they've got to figure that out. That's priority number one. Is who's going to carry the torch, so to speak, and are we going to let them? Are we going to let them? So
I guess we'll find out. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can listen to podcasts. See you later.